Hello everyone, this is Dr. Vlad Krotov, and in today's video lecture I will talk about managing project scope. Managing project scope is a very important topic in project management. By scope we mean the size of the project or what exactly needs to be done as a result of the project being completed. A scope statement is usually formulated early in the life cycle of a project, usually during the planning phase. A well-formulated scope statement is essential for project success. A scope statement that is unclear, ambiguous, or with conflicting objectives is likely to set up the project for failure from the very beginning. Another possible problem with a scope statement is a scope statement that is too big, too ambitious, too complex, too technologically advanced. Something like that, once again, will set the project for failure from the very beginning of the project lifecycle. So it is very important to formulate a clear scope that is also doable and well accepted by all the relevant stakeholders. And this is what this lecture is about. It's about formulating project scope and also related artifacts and best practices. So specifically, after completing this video lesson, you should be able to explain what project scope is and why it is important in project management. You should be able to list and discuss the main scope management processes or steps. You should be able to explain what scope creep is and how it can be avoided. You should be able to discuss best practices in scope management, explain what scope statement is, discuss techniques for gathering and managing user requirements, and also explain what a work breakdown structure is and how it can be constructed. So those are the main learning outcomes for this video lecture. So what is project scope? Project scope refers to the detailed outline of all the work required to deliver a product, service, or result as defined by the project requirements. So an important consideration here is that project scope is derived from project requirements. A project scope specifies what the project will include, and also by specifying what you will include, you're also helping formulate what you will exclude from the project. Clearly formulating and communicating both project inclusions, meaning what will be done, and exclusions, what will not be done, ensures that the project team and all the stakeholders have a clear understanding of the project boundaries. Because if they don't have a clear understanding of what needs to be done, how can they deliver what needs to be done? And if they don't understand project boundaries, then they may end up introducing additional work items, additional work packages, expanding the size and complexity of the project, something that is likely to result in project failure. So that's why project scope is very important. So what are some of the main elements of a project scope? First of all, clear project objectives. So those are the goals or objectives that the project aims to achieve. These objectives should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So the so-called SMART criteria. So specific means it cannot be vague. It needs to be clear, like what exactly are you trying to accomplish. Measurable means formulated in a way where you can measure and see whether you achieved it or not. Achievable means realistic, something that can be done given the resources that you have. Relevant means valuable, relevant for the overall goal of the project. And time-bound. Time-bound means there needs to be a time component, because if you don't have a time component within your goal or objective, then how will you know by when this objective needs to be completed? So let me give you an example of a project objective that does not meet SMART criteria, several of the SMART criteria. For example, if your objective is to improve customer satisfaction, it doesn't seem to be very specific enough. I mean, what do you mean by improve, right? What kind of customers are you talking about? All customers, certain customer groups, right? So it's not clear who are you talking about. So it's not specific. It's also not measurable, right? I mean, how do you know whether you improved it or not? Improved by how much, right? Again, because it's so unclear, it's not clear whether it's achievable or not. I mean, maybe it's impossible to improve customer satisfaction, at this stage of the company existence. So because it's not clear and measurable, we cannot really determine whether achievable or not. Relevant, well, I guess it seems to be relevant, but it's not clear like what the relevance is, again, due to the lack of clarity and specificity, and doesn't have any time dimension as well, right? So to reformulate this objective in a way that makes it smart, I would say something like that. Improve customer satisfaction, improve satisfaction of customers of a particular product B as measured, so that's the measurement component, as measured by the customer satisfaction survey by 5%. So now that's the measurement component within the next 2 months, right? So now it's something that is specific. You know exactly which customers you're talking about, customers that are buying a certain product. It's measurable because you're referring to the customer satisfaction survey. It's relevant, because it's linked. Let's say it's linked to the overall strategy of company of increasing sales or revenues, and it's time bound because because you specified that there's a certain time dimension, like let's say 2 months or 1 year associated with that goal, and because it's specific, measurable, relevant, and time bound, it's more likely to be achievable because there's more clarity as to what needs to be achieved. And 5% improvement in customer satisfaction over the duration of several months seems to be achievable, right? I mean, it's not like a goal that is too ambitious. So this is an example of a smart project objective. Also, another important element of a project scope are deliverables. Those are tangible or intangible outputs that the project is expected to produce. So that can include the end product or service itself, or some other outcomes that meet the project objective. So, for example, one grand deliverable of a project could be a CRM system, and some related outcomes could be customer satisfaction ranking, or some other related deliverables could be something like process manuals for the customer service team. A good project scope will also formulate inclusions and exclusions, what exactly you will do and what you will exclude from the project. So this helps clear statement of what's included and excluded, helps set expectations and prevent misunderstandings and scope creep, something that we're going to talk about later on. Constraints. So here you can discuss limitations or restrictions within which the project must operate, such as time, cost, resources, or technology limitations. For example, you can state that within your organization you cannot use non-Microsoft products, something like that, due to the contract that you have. So that would be something related to technology limitation or technology constraints. Or you may be constrained by the budget, right? So the whole thing needs to be completed within a certain budget that is allotted for this project. Assumptions, hypotheses, or conditions that you believe to be true at the start of the project. For example, you assume that the vendor, let's say that Microsoft, will collaborate with you on this project by providing you with certain guidance or consulting services. Assumptions can influence decisions and need to be validated or monitored during the project. Look, you cannot plan for everything precisely because any project, any significant endeavor involves quite a bit of uncertainty. But you need to be very clear with yourself and also with your team members and other stakeholders that you're making certain assumptions, right? And then, of course, you need to monitor both the internal and external environment to make sure that those assumptions actually materialize, right? Because sometimes your assumptions are wrong, which is, again, fine, but you need to admit that your assumptions were wrong and you need to find a workaround given the fact that your assumptions did not materialize. And another key component of a project scope is the so-called work breakdown structure, or WBS document. We're going to talk more about this artifact closer to the end of this video lecture. So you can think of it as a hierarchical to-do list or an hierarchical breakdown. So hierarchical means it's like an outline, structured outline. So it's an hierarchical breakdown of the project scope into smaller manageable components or tasks. So it ensures that every part of the scope is accounted for in the project. So once you break down your overall project into specific tasks, you are more likely to understand the specifics of the project, meaning like what exactly needs to be done, right? What are the specific tasks involved? You'll be in a better position to assign those tasks to your team members. You'll be in a better position to estimate the timeline and also to estimate other resources such as financial resources, giving that clarity, low-level clarity that you have. So a work breakdown structure is also very important for ensuring that every part of the scope is properly accounted for. So it's not just used to communicate what needs to be done. It's also used to control what's being done, when, and with what kind of resource consumption. So we're going to talk more about the work breakdown structure artifact towards the end of this lecture. So why is project scope important? A good project scope ensures clarity. It defines what is expected from the project and from the team members, helping to avoid confusion or misunderstanding among team members and stakeholders. It also assists with control. A good scope statement helps monitor and manage scope changes to prevent scope creep. So by scope creep, we mean the uncontrolled expansion of project scope without adjustments to time, cost, and resources. So in other words, once you formulate your project scope, you know what needs to be done. If somebody, and this is very natural, it happens all the time in all kinds of organizations, if somebody says, well, why don't you add something else to your project? You will go back to your scope and you'll say, look, this is a great idea to add another item, let's say another feature to our information system. However, this was not a part of the original scope. If you do want that additional feature to be included, then we need to reconsider the timeline and the budget, and perhaps assign other resources such as labor to this project, right? But usually it's a good idea to resist. I mean, it's a must to resist uncontrolled scope changes. If somebody proposes a change to project scope, especially in the later phases of the project, let's say closer to the closure of the project, then there really needs to be a very, very serious and valid reason for that change in the scope, right? And also, if it is believed that this is a very important addition to the project, then everybody needs to understand that additional time and money and other resources will be needed to accommodate that change. Also, a scope statement helps with resource allocation, because once you clearly specify what needs to be done, you're in a better position to understand what kind of resources and to at what levels need to be allocated to each part of the project. And overall, I would say that a project scope is very important to project success. I mean, a project scope is one of the fundamental, the so-called, it's a part of the so-called triple constraint model in project management. So scope is one constraint, the other one is time and cost. Now, realistically, in many situations, scope is the only constraint that a project manager has control of. You see, it's hard to control time because time passes no matter what. Now, some people would say that, well, you can control money, right? I mean, you can request additional funds for your project. It is a possibility. I would say money is a bit easier to control than time, but it's also a big issue, right? I mean, probably from your own experience that money funding is always a sensitive topic, and nobody within organizations throws money just like that, right? I mean, you really need to justify your budget, and once budget is allocated, typically it's very hard to get additional funds. So if you feel that, as a project manager, that your project is too complex, that there is a lot of complexity involved, then cutting down scope, not trying to do too many things, cutting out certain items from the project scope is the only realistic way of ensuring project success, because again, that's something that you have some degree of control. So yeah, that's why project scope is a very important factor in project success. So what are some of the main scope management processes or steps? So you start typically with understanding the project requirements. And the ultimate source on project requirements are end users or the stakeholders of the product or service that you're trying to deliver. Based on those requirements, once you collect and analyze those requirements, you should be able to define the scope. And then once you define the scope, at a higher level, you should be able to create a detailed work breakdown structure. Once you create your scope statement that also includes a detailed work breakdown structure, you should be able to validate scope. By validating scope, we mean talking to users to make sure that the scope statement is correct, that the work breakdown structure is complete, that the items there do not overlap or contradict each other. So once you validate your project scope, you are able to control scope during the execution phase. So as the project progresses, you compare what's being done to what was planned, right, in the scope statement, and see where you're at, whether you're missing some of the items, whether you're missing the deadlines in relation to those items or not. And then the final validation for the final phase of final validation for the scope is during the product closure. That's when you actually see whether the scope was completed or not, right? It's usually, not usually, but it's at the end of the project when those things become clear, whether you delivered what you promised in the scope statement or not. Now, we already mentioned this phenomena a couple of times. Project scope is very important for avoiding scope creep. By scope creep, we mean unauthorized changes or additional work creeping into the project. I already told you that this is very common. It happens all the time whenever you're trying to accomplish something as a project manager, as a project team. Some stakeholders will come in and say something, oh, since you're doing that, why don't you add this? Why don't you add another feature? Why don't you add another service to your project? Okay. Now, the general attitude that you should have is you should resist unauthorized changes. I mean, you should not just say, yes, I will do it simply because somebody's asking you, right? And one way to do it, one way to resist unauthorized changes is to go back to the scope statement in the work breakdown structure and say, look, what you're proposing is a great idea, but this was not included in the original scope statement. We don't have time, we don't have funds for it, we don't have labor, that can accommodate that additional change. But of course, I'm kind of talking more from the perspective of the waterfall approach to project management, where the scope or requirements are fixed from the planning stage. But even proponents of the traditional waterfall approach, they understand that change sometimes is necessary, right? I mean, you cannot just ignore all the requests that come to you during the execution phase, right? Now that's fine. Some changes are necessary, but they need to be authorized. And they can be authorized by the so-called Integrated Change Control Board. It's a committee that is comprised of various stakeholders. That also includes, these stakeholders also include representatives of the project team. So they should look. So all changes to the scope statement need to be submitted to the Integrated Change Control Board. So they will look at the request and they will evaluate its importance and feasibility, and either accept the change or reject it. Now, if they do accept the change, they will also facilitate the process of cascading the change through all relevant project documents, such as scope statement, work breakdown structure, budget, schedule, and so forth, right? So avoiding scope creep is important, but again, avoiding scope creep does not mean ignoring requests for a change. I mean, life is the best teacher, and sometimes when you work on the project, you do realize that you miss something, or one of your assumptions is not materializing. So it's okay, but again, you cannot do it in a haphazard way, like where people just say, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you change that? And you just comply with those requests without putting any critical thought or critical evaluation into those change requests. So what are some of the best practices in scope management? Clear communication. So you need to keep all stakeholders informed about the scope, any changes, authorized changes to the scope, and impacts of those changes throughout the project. So keeping everybody on board, communicating with everybody in relation to scope, what needs to be done, and changes to the scope is very important. You can use project management tools like MS Project, Jira, or Asana that can help you track scope changes and deliverables. In this class, I'm highly recommending that you use Project Libre to create your work breakdown structure, because once you create your work breakdown structure using Project Libre, then you will be able to rapidly generate your project schedule, project budget, although it's not necessary, and so forth, right? Not necessary for the purposes of your group project, to generate a budget using Project Libre. So I'll talk more about Project Libre and how work breakdown structures can be generated using that tool. You should involve stakeholders early and often. I mean, at the end of the day, you are building something not for yourself, not for your project team, but for end users, for stakeholders within the organization. So you need to get them involved early on. You need to engage them in the formulation of the scope. I mean, they need to tell you what needs to be done, because again, you're building a system or software application specifically for them, specifically to address their problems or their needs. So you need to get them involved early and listen to them throughout the duration of the project. Document everything. Keep detailed records of decision changes and approvals to avoid disputes, right? So that people cannot tell you like, oh, you didn't say that, or you didn't promise that, or you said, or you promised to do that. So everything needs to be properly documented so that you don't forget what was decided, what was promised, and you can always use it as a tool for resolving disputes. I mean, I've done it many times in my work where I ask people just to send me an email, not because I want to hold them accountable, but I just want to have a record of what was said and what was decided. So when they tell me something like, oh, I don't understand why we did that, I would say, look, this is your email, this is what we discussed, it's all captured here, and that's why we decided to do this. So the overall best practice is to stay flexible but firm, right? So you need to be open to necessary changes that are very necessary for ensuring your project success. But you should prevent scope creep, meaning unauthorized changes, by enforcing the integrated change control process or the integrated change control board. So you need to be firm about the scope, but at the same time flexible enough, because if something really emerges that needs to be accommodated, that would be madness to ignore it. So next we're going to talk about a scope statement. So we're just talking about scope statement more like as a concept. So now we're going to talk about scope statement as a formal document. So scopes are usually captured using two documents, which is a scope statement, scope statement, work statement, and also work breakdown structure, which can be a part of the scope statement. So once again, a scope statement is a formal document that outlines the entire scope of the project. So it serves as a foundational document. It's foundational to the overall project management plan. It guides the project team, stakeholders, and management throughout the project lifecycle, ensuring that everyone has a shared understanding of what the project entails. So now we're talking about scope statement as a document. So some of the typical sections within a scope statement, and you will see, I think, most, if not all of those statements in your group project. It needs to start with project objectives. What are the main things that you're trying to achieve with this project? And again, remember that objectives should be SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, which means every objective needs to meet all 5 SMART criteria, right? Project deliverables. What are the main deliverables of the project? Scope inclusion. So what exactly is included in your project? And scope exclusion. Sometimes you need to make clear that certain things are excluded from the project. For example, you can say that just to eliminate any kind of ambiguity or disagreements, you can say that a mobile version of the website is excluded from the scope of this project. Project constraints. What are the limitations that you have with respect to time, money, or technology, or other resources? Project assumptions. What are the things you believe to be true at the time the project is planned and scope is formulated? Acceptance criteria. What are the things that need to be true, right? To make sure that you have a valid reason to believe that the scope statement was delivered. Like, for example, one acceptance criteria would be, let's say, some kind of performance characteristic. Let's say the information system should have like 99.99% availability, right? So that if that's the case, then the project is accepted as successful. And also you may want to formulate some of the main project milestones, which means key deadlines for some key deliverables. Let's say project initiation would be one milestone, project plan approval would be another milestone, let's say some kind of midpoint presentation of the project progress during the execution phase could be another milestone, and so forth. So some of the key project milestones may also be included in the scope statement. Now next we're going to talk about managing user requirements. Remember we said earlier that a scope statement is formulated based on user requirements, meaning the wants, the needs of the users or the stakeholders that you're serving with your project. So how do you manage user requirements? It's a formal process. It cannot be just based on some informal conversation. So some steps for managing user requirements are as follows. So step number 1, identify stakeholders. Who are you serving with your project? Who are you trying to satisfy with your product or service that you're trying to develop? So once you identify relevant stakeholders, you should use multiple methods to gather requirements, and we're going to talk about some of those methods. So some of those methods, probably the most common method is interviews, but you can also use like archival documents. You can also use group interviews. There are many methodologies for gathering user requirements. So once you collect your user requirements using appropriate methodologies, you document user requirements in a requirements document. Then once you have everything documented, you validate those requirements by presenting them to stakeholders and getting their approval. And then if requirements change, you need to manage those requirements by updating the requirements document and again communicating the change to all the relevant stakeholders. And then validating requirements during testing. So when the product is developed, you test the product, the main deliverable, against the requirements that you specified to see whether those requirements were met or not. So those are the main steps for managing user requirements, because again, as we said before, user requirements are very important for documenting project scope. Now, what are some of the techniques or methodologies for gathering user requirements? I would say interview, just talking to people face to face, is the most common way of collecting user requirements. That's what most people think about when they need to collect requirements, when they need to understand what needs to be done. Indeed, interviews is a great method for collecting requirements. It has many advantages. I mean, when you meet with people, you can clarify your questions, you can explain to them if they don't understand your question. You can also use interviews to not only understand what people need, what end users or stakeholders need, you can also use interviews to build connections and to get them on board, to make them support your project. So interviews are very valuable. Now, the downside of interviews is that it's a very tedious and time-consuming method for collecting data. I mean, it takes time to organize interviews. It takes time from users, from stakeholders. That is especially problematic when you're interviewing top managers because they're very busy, their time is valuable. So interviews have a lot of downsides as well. Then you have surveys and questionnaires. So instead of interviewing people individually, you can develop a survey and send it to a big group of people within the organization. Now, the advantage of surveys over interviews is that it's fast, it's cheaper to do it that way. But I think the main disadvantages are as follows. Usually you get low response rate for online surveys, and when you do online surveys, there's no opportunity to build a connection with the respondents, to clarify your questions, to address their concerns, right? It's just like whatever you get there is what you get. Some project managers or systems analysts, they conduct workshops or group workshops where it's more like a group interview, where everybody gets together and you show people your preliminary requirements, then they give you feedback on those requirements, you collect additional requirements, then you prioritize that. Those group interviews, there are specific methodologies for conducting those group workshops or group interviews. So one of them is joint requirements planning, or JRP. So there's like a methodology for organizing those group workshops aimed at soliciting user requirements. So you may read more about them. Sometimes you collect user requirements simply by observing people, how they do their work, and based on that you figure out what needs to be done, what needs to be improved. Observations, the advantage of observations is that you actually, you don't talk to people because sometimes people say what they want to say, what they think you want to hear, right? But when you actually observe them, that's when it's not just words. You actually see how things are happening in real life. But of course it's not as simple as that. A lot of times end users and stakeholders, they're aware that somebody's observing them, and because they're aware of that, they change the way they behave, so they don't do things in their usual inefficient or problematic way. Sometimes you gather requirements through document analysis. So instead of interviewing people or sending a survey, you just study existing documents to see what's already known about the problem that you're trying to address. So that will save a lot of time. And prototyping is another method. So prototyping means, it's hard for some users to formulate what exactly they need, especially if they're not technology savvy. You cannot go to just like a business user and ask, so what kind of information system you need, right? So instead, you will show them a prototype, like you will show them, let's say, an existing solution that you built, or maybe from some other company, and you will say, so what do you think? I mean, look at this solution. Will it solve your problem? Why or why not? What are the changes that need to be done? So prototyping means you gather requirements by actually showing people something, meaning a prototype of a potential solution. And that is believed to be a better, more effective way of gathering requirements, especially from users who are not technology savvy, or who are simply not creative enough to really give you like great ideas as to what needs to be done or what needs to be changed. So those are some of the techniques for gathering user requirements or methodologies. Now, one of the most important deliverable or aspect or element of a scope statement is the so-called work breakdown structure. So a work breakdown structure, as we said before, is an hierarchical decomposition of a project scope into smaller, specific, more manageable components or tasks. So basically, when you create a work breakdown structure, you take the overall project scope and you break it down into specific deliverables and work packages, and you organize them using a clear visual hierarchical representation of the work that needs to be completed. So the purpose of a work breakdown structure is to organize and define the total scope of the project in terms of specific tasks so that it can be planned, executed, and controlled for effectively throughout the duration of the project. So this is how a work breakdown structure looks like. So remember, it's an hierarchical decomposition of the scope. So by level 1, we typically mean the overall project, right? So at level 1, you have website redesign project. At level 2, you have the following high-level items or tasks: website front-end design, content management system integration, and mobile, meaning like optimizing the website for mobile phones. Now, those level 2 items are usually not specific enough to make them clear or smart, right? To make them assignable to people. So that's why typically level 2 items are broken down into level 3 items. For example, website front-end design can be broken down into the following level 3 items: creating a homepage, designing product pages, and developing blog sections. So once you do that, you can assign those level 3 items to specific people. You can assign resources and deadlines for those specific tasks, right? But sometimes you may want to break it down even further, like to level 4, but usually, you don't want to have a work breakdown structure that is too complex and too hierarchical. So keeping it to level 3 only is a good idea, right? So that you avoid unnecessary complexity in your task. Now, there's a lot that goes into your work breakdown structure. I mean, I recommend that you organize your work breakdown structure using the project lifecycle model that we discussed before. So you start with initiation, then you go to planning, execution, then you have closing phase, and then also you detail your monitoring and controlling phase that usually spans all phases, not just the execution phase. And then within those level 2 items, you can create level 3 or even level 4 items if it's needed. Then you need to analyze those items to make sure they don't overlap, to make sure they don't contradict to each other. So you need to spend a lot of time looking at your work breakdown structure, because again, it's a very important document that will define what the project is about. It will also dictate what kind of resources you need and how much time you need for the execution of your project. So the general steps for creating a work breakdown structure are as follows. You define the project scope, right? So create like a high-level description of what needs to be done. Identify major deliverables. Then you can decompose those deliverables into level 3 and level 4 items. Then you can organize it. You'll go through this work breakdown structure one more time to make sure that items are not misplaced, they're properly organized. And then you will review and validate it with stakeholders to make sure that everybody agrees and understands what are the details of the scope statement as formulated by the work breakdown structure. So this completes our video presentation on project scope statement. At this point, I would like to suggest that you pause on this slide and see if you can answer these review questions. If you can answer those review questions, that's great. If not, then you probably have to go back to chapter notes or to revisit this video lecture again to make sure you understand what a project scope is, why it's important, and what are the main processes and artifacts related to the scope statement. That's it. Thank you for listening.
The juggle is real. I'm spinning these wheels, holding it tight while chaos reveals the